Nancy Kulp was the last person anyone expected to be at the center of old Hollywood's hidden love stories. Best known as the quirky and endearing Miss Jane Hathaway on the Beverly Hillbillies, her public image was as tidy and uncontroversial as they come. But behind the prim suits and no-nonsense persona, Nancy carried secrets that would only begin to surface years after her fame faded. She wasn't just a straight-laced secretary type the audience saw every week. She was someone with depth, mystery, and a life shaped by secrecy. Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s wasn't just glamorous, it was ruthless. Image meant everything, and straying from the expected narrative could cost you everything. Nancy knew that all too well. Though she lived quietly, rumors always hovered around her, whispers that never made the tabloids but echoed behind closed doors, that she was gay and that she had been romantically linked to some of the most iconic women in film history. But none of it was ever confirmed, until much later. What's most shocking isn't just a suggestion that Nancy Kulp had secret relationships, but who those relationships may have involved. We're talking about names that defined eras. Starlets, legends, women whose own lives were cloaked in mystery and carefully curated by studios that wouldn't allow even a hint of scandal to surface. Nancy wasn't just a bystander to these stories. She was part of them. This video uncovers the real Nancy Kulp, the one who lived behind the curtain. We'll explore the private life she fought to protect, the rumored romances with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, and the choices she made in an industry that left no room for women like her to be themselves. These aren't just old gossip tales. They're pieces of a bigger story about fame, fear, and the price of living honestly in a dishonest time. And if you think you've heard it all about old Hollywood, just wait, because the names Nancy Kulp is believed to have been involved with might just change the way you see that golden era forever. But first, we have to understand the image Nancy projected to the world, and how it was used to hide a truth that only a few people dared to whisper about. To the world, Nancy Kulp was Miss Jane Hathaway, an efficient, slightly awkward secretary with a heart of gold and a comedic stiff upper lip. On the Beverly Hillbillies, she became a staple of American television, forever immortalized in reruns as the prim, proper, unmarried woman who pined for her clueless boss. She was funny, charming, and totally inoffensive. It was a role tailor-made to be loved by audiences across generations. But Nancy Kulp herself? She was much more complex. What fans didn't see was a woman beneath the surface, a highly intelligent, fiercely private person with a deep sense of independence. Before she ever stepped onto a soundstage, Nancy earned a master's degree in journalism and even served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. She was no lightweight and certainly no stereotype. But Hollywood didn't care about depth. It cared about image. And Nancy's image became fixed in the minds of millions, sweet, strange, and safely sexless. That worked to her advantage. For a while her co-stars were frequently written about in gossip columns, Nancy managed to avoid the spotlight off camera. There were no leaked romances, no whirlwind marriages, no messy public scandals. That silence, however, led to its own rumors. Industry insiders whispered that Nancy preferred the company of women, and that her personal life was kept tightly under wraps because it didn't align with what the studios wanted the public to see. Behind closed doors, Nancy wasn't hiding in shame. She was protecting her life. Hollywood's unwritten rules didn't allow women like her to be open. Lesbianism, or even a hint of nonconformity in gender roles, could lead to contract cancellations and blacklisting. Many actresses of that era were forced into fake relationships with male stars just to keep up appearances. Nancy simply chose another path. She didn't fake anything. She just didn't share. That decision helped her survive, but also kept her truth locked away from the audience that adored her. What's even more telling is how rarely she was asked about her personal life at all. In a world obsessed with celebrity romance, Nancy flew under the radar, a feat in itself. When asked in later years about her romantic past, she would often smile and change the subject, offering just enough warmth to deflect without ever revealing too much. Those close to her knew it was intentional. The less she said, the safer she stayed. Still, those who worked with her often recalled her as generous, quick-witted, and loyal. She had deep friendships with fellow actresses, some of whom were themselves the subject of similar whispers. To this day, no verified photos or reports exist of Nancy in romantic situations. And yet, the persistent rumors suggest something more than just close friendships. Nancy Kulp played her cards close to the chest. But that quiet approach to fame was exactly what allowed her to live a life most people never imagined. And that's where things begin to get even more interesting. Because behind the scenes, some of those friendships may not have been so innocent. Being gay in mid-century Hollywood wasn't just taboo. It was dangerous. Careers could be destroyed overnight. Reputations shattered with a whisper, and contracts dissolved without explanation. Nancy Kulp knew this. She saw it happen to others. And she understood that to survive in that world, you had to play the game. But while many bent the rules quietly or fake relationships for the cameras, Nancy chose discretion. Total privacy was her armor, and it worked most of the time. In those decades, the studio system was an ironclad machine. Publicists and producers curated every part of stars' life, from how they dressed to who they were seen with. If a rumor began to surface about someone's sexuality, the response was immediate. Spin the story, set up a faux engagement, plant press photos with an opposite-sex co-star. It was all about optics. For women, especially those who didn't fit the bombshell mold, the pressure was immense. And for women like Nancy, smart, quirky, and unbothered by heteronormative expectations, the path was even narrower. Nancy never confirmed anything publicly about her orientation during her acting years, but colleagues and friends often describe her as someone who lived truthfully, just not loudly. She was known to have a small but tight circle of confidants, mostly women, who respected her boundaries and valued her trust. These weren't just work friends. These were chosen companions in an industry that punished authenticity. Behind closed doors, Nancy was reportedly warm and witty, with a love for literature and politics. She was far from isolated, but her private life was simply off-limits to the public. Some who knew her have hinted that she had long-term relationships, quiet affairs that stayed well outside the tabloids. These whispers suggest that Nancy didn't just stay silent because of fear. She stayed silent because she wanted control over her narrative, something most actresses of the time never got to have. The costs were steep. Nancy turned down roles she didn't feel comfortable with and kept her home life a closely guarded secret. She rarely attended the flashy parties or mingled with gossip columnists. Her detachment from the scene made her an outsider in some circles, but also helped her avoid the worst of Hollywood's invasive spotlight. And perhaps more importantly, it allowed her to live with integrity, even if it was behind closed doors. Others in her orbit weren't as lucky. Some actresses were outed and promptly blacklisted. Others were pushed into sham marriages and lived decades in silence. Nancy's story, in contrast, shows that discretion could be a kind of rebellion. She didn't conform, but she didn't broadcast it either. And that quiet resistance may have helped her forge genuine connections that weren't based on image or expectations. In many ways, Nancy's Hollywood journey was a balancing act, staying authentic without stepping too far outside the bounds of what was considered acceptable. She wasn't trying to be a rebel. She was just trying to be herself. And in that era, that in itself was radical. What's most fascinating is how her silence protected more than just her career. It protected the women she cared about, because some of the names linked to Nancy were not just private, they were icons. And those stories? They're next. In the coded language of old Hollywood, friendships between women were often the only socially acceptable way to stay close without raising alarms. But those in the know, agents, stylists, co-stars, often whispered that Nancy Kulp's friendships were far deeper than the public ever saw. Over the years, a few names kept surfacing again and again in connection with Nancy. And while nothing was ever publicly confirmed, the consistency of those rumors suggests that they weren't just idle gossip. One of the most frequently mentioned names was Barbara Stanwyck, known for her strong, often masculine energy on-screen and her refusal to conform off-screen. Stanwyck had long been the subject of rumors about her orientation. She was fiercely private, just like Nancy, and the two were known to have spent time together offset. Both women shared a love for books, politics, and deep conversations, the kind of bond that could easily evolve into something more in private. Another rumored connection was with Marjorie Main, best known for her role in the Ma and Pa Kettle films. Main, like Nancy, was a character actress who lived far outside the mold of the typical Hollywood starlet. The two were close, and insiders claim that their relationship bordered on romantic. What's more interesting is that both women lived alone, had no long-term male partners, and were often seen as confirmed bachelorettes by the press, a term that back then was often used as a coded nod to lesbian women. There were also whispers involving the great Tallulah Bankhead, a known bisexual and flamboyant socialite. Bankhead was the polar opposite of Nancy in public behavior. But that may have been the very thing that drew them together. While it's unclear how close they were, it's believed they moved in overlapping circles. In Hollywood, proximity often meant opportunity, and opportunity often led to private moments never meant for public consumption. One of the most surprising rumors, however, links Nancy to Katharine Hepburn. While this remains highly speculative, it's been noted that both women were extremely guarded, highly intelligent, and had complicated personal lives. Hepburn's long-debated relationship with Spencer Tracy was seen by many as a studio invention, and she was known to surround herself with strong, independent women. While there's no concrete evidence of a romance, the idea that Nancy might have quietly shared space in that rarefied circle isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. To be clear, none of these alleged romances have been confirmed, but their persistence tells us something important. Nancy Kulp was not living in isolation. She was part of a hidden network of women who defied the norms of their time, not loudly, but clearly. Their connections, though unspoken, were powerful. And for Nancy, those bonds may have been the most meaningful relationships of her life. What's most remarkable is that through all the years of speculation, Nancy never denied or confirmed a thing. That silence, intentional or not, gave her protection. But it also left space for stories to grow. And some of those stories have never fully surfaced. Until now. Coming up next, we explore how Nancy's later life revealed more than anyone expected, and how one offhand comment nearly confirmed everything fans have been speculating for decades. Nancy Kulp's silence wasn't just personal, it was strategic. In a world where one wrong word could destroy everything you built, discretion was survival. But that silence, maintained so tightly throughout her career, wasn't just about protecting herself. It was also about protecting the women she may have loved, and the fragile reputations they worked so hard to preserve. Nancy came up in an era where the studio system controlled every narrative. Stars were assigned relationships. Spontaneous love affairs were coordinated by publicists, and gay or bisexual actors were pressured or forced into the closet. For a woman like Nancy, who didn't fit the mold of the leading lady or the glamorous femme fatale, the threat of exposure might have seemed less immediate. But make no mistake, she knew the risk. Unlike some stars who were coerced into lavender marriages or fabricated romances, Nancy simply refused to play the game. She didn't issue fake statements. She didn't pose for carefully staged photos with male co-stars. She just said nothing. It was a masterclass in self-preservation, especially in a town that thrived on scandal. And the less she gave the press to work with, the more they eventually left her alone. But Nancy's silence was never cold or distant. Those who knew her said she had an infectious wit, a genuine warmth, and a deep kindness. She just didn't let people in, at least not fully. Friends from her Navy days, former castmates, and even political colleagues later in life all describe her as someone who could carry a meaningful conversation for hours without ever revealing anything she didn't want to. And then there's the matter of timing. Nancy came of age in a post-war America obsessed with conformity. By the time she became a household name, the anti-communist panic of the McCarthy era had already extended its reach to the entertainment industry. Being labeled different for your politics, your relationships, your beliefs could get you blacklisted. Even after that era passed, the stigma around homosexuality didn't. So Nancy waited and waited and waited. It wasn't until much later, long after the Beverly Hillbillies had ended and her days in the spotlight had dimmed, that Nancy began to drop hints. In a rare interview in the 1980s, she described herself as a gentlewoman bachelor, a term loaded with historical weight. For decades, it was code for women who lived outside traditional romantic norms. She never elaborated, but she didn't deny it either. And that quiet acknowledgement told some people everything they needed to know. She also threw herself into politics, even running for Congress in Pennsylvania. during that campaign. Her personal life again became a topic, one she refused to exploit or deny. She spoke about policies, not romance, values, not labels. It was clear that Nancy wanted to be judged for her actions, not her private life. But one comment stood out. When asked in passing about her long history of not marrying, she replied with a smile, "Why ruin a good thing?" It was playful, deflective, and deeply telling. Nancy's silence was never about shame. It was about power, the power to control her story in an industry that tried to write everyone else's. She chose privacy over performance. And in doing so, she carved out a life that, while hidden, was hers alone. Up next, we'll explore how the whispers surrounding Nancy's past never quite died down, and how one late-in-life interview may have revealed more than she ever intended. For decades, Nancy Kulp had kept her cards close to the chest. She played the role of the charming enigma well, always deflecting questions with wit, always changing the subject when things got too personal. But in one of her final interviews, a seemingly offhand remark set off a wave of renewed interest in her private life, and led some to believe that she had finally, quietly, confirmed what many had long suspected. It was the late 1980s, long after the Beverly Hillbillies had ended, and Nancy was living a much quieter life. She'd shifted her focus to politics and education, teaching at a small liberal arts college and continuing to engage in the public sphere, but this time on her own terms. She had run for Congress in Pennsylvania in 1984, a bold and unlikely move for someone who had built her fame in the world of make-believe. That campaign, though unsuccessful, was marked by grace and integrity, even when the press tried to pry into her personal life. In one of her last sit-down interviews, a journalist gently pressed her on the topic that had long lingered in the background of her career. Why had she never married? Nancy, ever the wordsmith, didn't dodge the question, but she didn't answer in the way anyone expected either. "I've always found happiness in companionship," she said, "but I never felt the need to explain the nature of it to anyone." It was simple, calm, unapologetic. The interviewer followed up, pressing her further. "Was there ever a great love in your life?" Nancy paused. Then, with a faint smile, she replied, "There were several. Some lasted longer than others. Some weren't meant for public stories." To many, it was the closest she had ever come to an acknowledgement. No dramatic confession, no big reveal, just a quiet truth, folded carefully into a sentence. It was classic Nancy, honest without being explicit, emotional without being exposed. But for those who had followed her career and the rumors, it felt monumental. Here was a woman who had spent decades navigating an industry obsessed with appearances, finally choosing to hint at something deeper. That moment didn't make headlines. It wasn't plastered across tabloids. But in LGBTQ circles, it was noted, remembered, treasured. And it wasn't just her words that spoke volumes. It was her tone, her peace. Nancy didn't speak like someone harboring a scandal. She spoke like someone who had made peace with her choices and no longer felt the need to justify to anyone. That interview, brief as it was, marked a shift. Fans began revisiting old clips, rereading old interviews, and reassessing the narrative that had surrounded Nancy for so long. Was Miss Jane Hathaway really just a comic relief character? Or was she the coded expression of a woman who never fit into the boxes she was handed? Nancy never gave another interview like that. Not long afterward, her health declined, and she slipped out of the public eye entirely. But that conversation, those few lines, remain a powerful moment of clarity. They reminded us that truth doesn't always need to be shouted. Sometimes it's whispered, and if you're paying attention, you hear it loud and clear. Nancy Kulp may never have been a household name in the way Marilyn Monroe or Elizabeth Taylor were, but her legacy is no less significant, especially for those who understand the deeper currents that ran beneath her carefully managed public image. While she never publicly came out in the traditional sense, the way she lived, the choices she made, and the quiet power of her presence all contributed to a subtle but vital kind of resistance. In her own understated way, Nancy helped redefine what it meant to live truthfully in an industry built on illusion. By the time she passed away in 1991, Nancy Kulp had transitioned from comedic actress to cultural icon of a different sort, an unspoken trailblazer, particularly in LGBTQ circles. Her death didn't spark scandal or controversy. Instead, it inspired reflection. Friends, colleagues, and fans began to speak more openly about the life she led off camera, the kindness she showed, the relationships she guarded, and the dignity with which she protected her identity. Today, Nancy is increasingly recognized as a quiet pioneer. In an age before public declarations were safe or even possible, for queer people, especially women in Hollywood, she managed to create a life filled with love, community, and meaning. That matters, because it shows that visibility isn't the only path to empowerment. Sometimes, privacy is its own form of protest. For LGBTQ actors still navigating the industry's complicated relationship with authenticity, Nancy's story serves as a reminder that not every act of defiance has to be loud to be powerful. She didn't fake a marriage for publicity. She didn't let herself be pulled into the studio system's tangled web of sham romances and cover stories. She simply didn't participate. That refusal, while subtle, was radical in its own right. In the years since her death, Nancy has become something of a cult figure, particularly among queer audiences looking to the past for stories that mirror their own. Social media forums and fan blogs have revived interest in her life, her rumored romances, and her legacy. And as new generations of viewers discover the Beverly Hillbillies, many are watching Miss Jane Hathaway with new eyes, not just as a funny character, but as a symbol of quiet complexity in a world that demanded simplicity. The cultural conversation has evolved, too. Today, there are more openly LGBTQ performers than ever before, and stories that once had to be whispered are now celebrated. But this progress was built on the backs of people like Nancy, people who had to navigate an unforgiving system and still manage to live meaningful, truthful lives under immense pressure. Her story reminds us that authenticity doesn't always come with a spotlight. Sometimes it comes in a form of restraint, silence, or a knowing smile in an interview. Sometimes it's in the friendships we cherish and protect. And sometimes it's in the legacy we leave behind, quiet but unshakable. Nancy Kulp may never have made headlines with her love life, but she didn't need to. Her life spoke for itself. And now, more than ever, we're finally learning how to listen. Nancy Kulp's life might seem like a relic of a different Hollywood, one shaped by studio contracts, gossip columnists, and secrets whispered behind closed doors. But in truth, her story resonates more now than ever. At a time when visibility is both celebrated and commodified, Nancy represents a different kind of power, the kind that comes from protecting your truth, even when the world demands you surrender it. Today, representation is front and center in conversations around media and entertainment. Queer characters are being written into scripts, openly LGBTQ actors are leading blockbuster films, and audiences are demanding authenticity. But while progress is real, it's important not to forget the people who made it possible. Nancy Kulp didn't break down the doors with dramatic declarations. She helped chip away at them quietly, without asking for recognition. Her story matters because it challenges our assumptions about what queer history looks like. Not every pioneer is loud. Not every protest is a march. And not every legacy is built in headlines. Nancy's life reminds us that there were and still are countless people whose resistance comes in the form of subtlety. People who navigate impossible systems with grace, who found ways to love without fanfare, and who chose dignity over spectacle. In a culture that often values visibility above all else, Nancy's example offers something different. She shows us that privacy can be powerful, that choosing not to disclose every detail isn't necessarily fear. It can be strategy, protection, or simply personal choice. And for queer people still grappling with how much of themselves to share with the world, Nancy's life provides reassurance that there is no one right way to live openly. Her legacy also prompts us to revisit how we talk about history. So many queer figures have been left out of mainstream narratives simply because they didn't or couldn't declare their identity. But silence does not erase impact. The absence of public confirmation doesn't mean these stories don't deserve to be told. Nancy's rumored romances, her careful choices, and her quiet courage are all pieces of a larger puzzle, a history that's finally being recognized and reclaimed. There's also something incredibly modern about Nancy's story. The idea of setting boundaries, curating your image, and choosing who gets access to your private life. That's not just Hollywood survival. That's the very essence of today's digital age. In that way, Nancy was ahead of her time. She understood instinctively that not everything needed to be shared to be real. Some things, especially the most sacred things, are best kept just out of reach. Ultimately, Nancy Kulp's story matters because it helps fill in the gaps. It connects the dots between what we saw on the screen and what we now understand was happening behind it. It reminds us that the golden age of Hollywood was never just black and white. There were shades of nuance, of bravery, and of love that had to stay hidden. Until now. In remembering Nancy, we don't just honor one woman's story. We honor the untold lives of so many others who had to smile for the cameras while guarding their deepest truths. And we ensure that, going forward, no one has to hide the way they did. When Nancy Kulp passed away in 1991, there was no dramatic media reckoning, no expose revealing her secrets, no headline-grabbing tell-all. Her death was noted with respect, her achievements acknowledged, and her most iconic role, Miss Jane Hathaway, fondly remembered. But even in death, Nancy Kulp remained consistent. She exited the stage with dignity, letting her legacy speak louder than her private life ever had. And what a legacy it is. For most audiences, Nancy is still remembered as a beloved character actress, someone who brought humor and humanity to a sitcom character who could have easily been a one-note stereotype. But what makes her story so enduring isn't just her on-screen work. It's the quiet subversion that ran underneath it. While the world laughed along with her performances, she was carefully crafting a life that defied the rules she was expected to follow. That legacy, once invisible, is now being re-examined. In recent years, queer historians and LGBTQ advocates have begun to highlight figures like Nancy, people whose identities weren't fully visible but who helped make space for others simply by surviving and thriving in a system that wasn't built for them. Nancy's name is now appearing in books, articles, and conversations about queer Hollywood, not as a footnote, but as a meaningful example of quiet courage. Even more telling is how modern queer audiences are embracing her. Fans, critics, and cultural commentators alike have looked back at Nancy's work and recognized the signs. The careful word choices, the strategic silences, the moments where something just under the surface hinted at more. And in those reflections, there's something healing. It's a reminder that even if you didn't grow up seeing queer lives openly celebrated on TV, they were still there, hidden in plain sight. Nancy also left behind a template for how to be yourself on your own terms. In a world where personal lives are increasingly public, she remains a model for boundaries. Her refusal to be boxed in, her resistance to explain herself, and her insistence on crafting her own narrative now feel not just brave, but radical. She didn't need the world's approval to live authentically, and that kind of quiet self-possession is something we can all learn from. Perhaps the most touching part of Nancy's legacy lies in how she impacted the people around her. Many who worked with her describe her as kind, sharp, and unpretentious. She mentored younger actors, supported causes she believed in, and treated everyone, from studio heads to stagehands, with the same level of respect. While the public may not have known the full truth about Nancy Kulp, those who did knew her as someone who lived with purpose, compassion, and grace. In the end, legacy isn't just about what's said in obituaries or written in history books. It's about what endures. And for Nancy Kulp, what endures is more than her work or her rumored romances. It's the example she set. A woman who lived authentically in an inauthentic time. A performer who stayed true to herself. Even when no one was watching, she didn't need to shout her truth for it to matter. She just had to live it. And now, decades later, we're finally beginning to hear it that EY did. Nancy Kulp's life story might seem like a quiet one. A character actress who lived discreetly, avoided scandal, and disappeared from the public eye without much noise. But when you dig beneath the surface, it becomes clear that Nancy's journey resonates more now than ever. In an age where discussions around gender, sexuality, representation, and authenticity dominate our cultural conversations, Nancy's story isn't just historically interesting, it's deeply relevant. For one, Nancy represents the countless queer individuals throughout history who lived full lives under the radar. In her era, coming out wasn't just risky, it was nearly impossible if you wanted to keep your job, your safety, and your dignity. And yet, Nancy carved out space for herself. She didn't pretend to be someone else. She didn't parade around with a fake husband or try to correct her persona. Instead, she lived honestly in her own quiet way. That subtle form of defiance, refusing to lie even when silence was the only safe option, carries weight. Today, younger generations of LGBTQ plus people have more freedom than ever to live openly, but that freedom was built on the backs of those who couldn't. Nancy's story is a crucial piece of that larger history. She might not have waved a flag or made a speech, but her very existence and her decision to hold firm to her boundaries helped move the cultural needle forward. She's part of a lineage of unsung heroes who resisted invisibility not with noise, but with quiet authenticity. Her story also complicates our understanding of old Hollywood. We often remember that time as glamorous and simple, a golden age of charm and star power. But beneath the gloss were people like Nancy, who had to carefully construct public personas to avoid the crushing power of an unforgiving industry. By revisiting Nancy's life, we challenge that nostalgic myth and gain a more honest, nuanced picture of the entertainment world's past. And there's a broader lesson, too. Nancy's life reminds us that visibility isn't the only path to impact. In a culture obsessed with being seen, posted, shared, and celebrated, it's easy to overlook the power of private courage. Nancy made a choice not to deny who she was, but to protect it. That boundary setting, that deep self-knowledge, is something worth honoring. Her strength didn't come from grand gestures. It came from refusing to be anything other than herself. In remembering Nancy Kulp, we're doing more than filling an historical blank. We're expanding the story of what it means to live truthfully. Her legacy isn't just for queer women or actors or fans of the Beverly Hillbillies. It's for anyone who's ever felt the pressure to conform, to hide, or to pretend. Nancy's life tells us that dignity doesn't require approval. It just requires staying rooted in who you are, even when the world isn't ready for it. So yes, Nancy Kulp's story matters. It matters because it reflects how far we've come. And it matters because it shows us how far we still have to go. As much as we've uncovered about Nancy Kulp, her career, her politics, the whispers of hidden romances, there are still things we'll never know. There are no love letters tucked away in archives, no tabloid scandals or dramatic confessions. Her most intimate truths were hers alone, and she took them with her when she passed. And that, in many ways, is the point. The modern impulse is to seek answers, to uncover every detail, to shine a light in every shadow. But in Nancy's case, there's a kind of grace in the mystery. She was a woman who lived during a time when survival often meant silence, and she mastered the art of saying just enough, never more. Even when the world changed and it became safer for people to speak openly, Nancy chose not to, not out of shame, but because she never owed us her truth in the first place. Some may find that frustrating. We live in a tell-all era where public figures are expected to share everything, from their heartbreaks to their health scares. But Nancy belonged to a different world, one where privacy was sacred. The fact that she maintained that boundary, even decades after she left Hollywood, says a lot about who she was. She wasn't hiding, she was protecting something. Maybe herself, maybe the people she loved, maybe just the dignity of a life lived without explanation. There's something powerful about honoring that decision. Too often, we treat queer history as a puzzle to be solved. Every relationship either confirmed or denied. But queer lives, like all lives, are textured and complex. They don't always fit into neat boxes or provide satisfying conclusions. Nancy's story is a reminder that ambiguity isn't the same as erasure. In fact, sometimes it's the most honest reflection of what it meant to exist in a world that didn't want to see you clearly. That's not to say we shouldn't speculate or explore. The conversations around Nancy's rumored relationships are important. They shed light on how queer women navigated impossible systems, how they found love and companionship despite the risks. But at the end of the day, Nancy's legacy isn't defined by what we can confirm. It's defined by what she represented. A refusal to compromise her sense of self, even when the stakes were high. She left behind a body of work that made millions laugh. She served her country, ran for office, and carved out a unique space in an industry that often rewards conformity over authenticity. Whether she loved one woman, many, or none at all isn't the only question worth asking. The better question might be, how did she live with integrity in a world that demanded masks? Nancy Kulp didn't give us all the answers, but maybe she didn't need to. Maybe the way she carried herself, the wit, the quiet defiance, the careful joy, is the answer. And maybe, in accepting the limits of what we can know, we find a deeper truth she left behind. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do isn't to explain yourself. It's to live fully and unapologetically, whether the world understands you or not. Nancy Kulp was more than just a TV icon. She lived a life full of secrets, strength, and quiet rebellion. Her rumor romances and private battles showed just how much she protected her truth in a world that demanded silence. If you found this story intriguing, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.